The morning I handed over that last $10 bill, my hands were shaking. Not from cold. It was August 1987, and the air in Harlan County sat on you like a wet blanket. My hands were shaking because that bill was everything I had left in the world. $11.40 when I drove out of Columbus. A tank of gas ate most of it, and there I stood in the parking lot of the Harlan County Recorder's office, handing a crumpled 10 to a man named Gerald Fitch, who smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper, signing my name to a deed for 43 acres of the most laughed-at land in eastern Iowa. Gerald didn't laugh, to his credit. He just stapled the receipt to the carbon copy, slid it across the counter, and said, "Good luck with that one, Mr. Hope." The way he said it told me everything about how much luck he thought I'd need. I was 62 years old. I had worked 31 years in Cincinnati managing inventory for a machine parts distributor, Halverson Industrial Supply, over on Northland Road. Good job, steady job. The kind of job that swallows a man whole if he stays long enough, which I did. My wife, Eleanor, passed in February of that year, a Tuesday, snow on the ground. After the funeral, I sat in our apartment on Stelzer Road for 4 months and watched the walls. Then, I sold everything that would sell, packed what fit in my '79 Ford F-150, and drove west until the cities thinned out and the corn started. I hadn't farmed a day in my adult life, but my father had. His father had. There was something in me that believed, maybe foolishly, maybe correctly, I still haven't fully decided, that the land would know that somehow. The 43 acres on County Road F14 had been sitting empty since 1971. 16 years of nobody. The farmhouse was a 1930s build, wood frame, white paint that had given up being white sometime around 1978. The barn leaned 11 degrees to the southeast. I measured it later with a level and a protractor, because that's the kind of man I became out there. The well pump was seized. 3 of the 4 fence lines had collapsed entirely, and the neighbors made sure I understood what I'd done. Dale Pritchard, who ran 600 acres to the north, drove over the first week and stood at the edge of my property line looking at the house, the way a doctor looks at an x-ray that confirms what he already suspected. He said, "You paid $10 for this?" I told him yes. He said, "Son, I wouldn't have paid 5. He wasn't being cruel. He was being honest, which in some ways is worse. But none of that. Not Gerald Fitch's pity, not Dale Pritchard's arithmetic, not the leaning barn or the dead pump. None of it is what this story is actually about. It's about what I found in the backyard, or more precisely, what found me. It was the 3rd morning, a Tuesday in early April 1987. The frost hadn't fully left the ground. You could feel it through the soles of your boots, that particular resistance the earth has when it's still holding winter in its chest. I was walking the back perimeter of the property, trying to map in my head what could be saved and what was already gone, when I noticed it. At first I thought it was a root mass. Old farms collect them. When a tree gets taken down but the stump isn't pulled, the ground above it heaves and settles over the decades into something that looks almost intentional. But there was no tree nearby. The nearest elm was 40 feet to the east, and this mound was nowhere in its root range. It sat maybe 60 feet from the back of the house, roughly circular, perhaps 4 feet across and 18 inches high at its center. The grass growing over it was a slightly different color than the surrounding ground. Darker green, more deliberate somehow. I stood there for a while. That's something the city had nearly taken from me. The capacity to just stand somewhere and let a place speak without rushing it. I'd spent 22 years in Columbus making fast decisions because fast decisions were what the work rewarded. Standing still felt like failure back then. Out here, it started to feel like the only honest thing left to do. I circled the mound twice. I pressed the heel of my boot against the near edge. The ground gave differently there. Not soft exactly, but less resistant than the frozen clay around it. Like something underneath was interrupting the cold. Like the earth had a reason to be warmer in that one spot. I went back to the house and found a long-handled spade in the barn. The handle had a crack running 6 inches up from the blade socket, wrapped tight with what looked like baling wire. Probably 20 years old. The kind of repair a man makes when he intends to keep using a tool until it tells him otherwise. I brought it out to the mound, and I stood over it again. I didn't dig that morning. I want to be honest about that. I stood there with the spade and I looked at it, and I thought about what Gerald Fitch had said to me at the gas station in Millbrook the day before, that I was going to spend everything I had left trying to make a dead property breathe, and that no amount of stubbornness changes the arithmetic of a bad investment. I thought about Dale Pritchard saying he wouldn't have paid $5. And then I thought about the fact that someone had lived on this land before me. Someone had worked it, walked it, known every inch of it the way I was only beginning to know it. And that person, whoever they were, had put something here, or built something here, or buried something here. Because mounds like this don't happen by accident. I pushed the spade into the edge of the mound and felt it stop against something hard, about 8 inches down. I pulled the spade back and pushed it in again, 2 inches to the left. Same thing. Something hard, flat, and continuous. Not a rock, because a rock has an edge you can find if you work around it. This had no edge I could locate in either direction. I set the spade down and got on my knees in the wet grass and pushed my fingers into the loose soil at the mound's base. The ground was cold and it smelled like iron and old rain. I worked my fingers down until I felt it smooth, not rough textured like limestone or sandstone. Smooth the way metal gets when it has been protected from air for a very long time. I sat back on my heels and looked at my hands. The dirt under my fingernails was almost black. I went to the truck and got the short-handled mattock I'd been using to clear brush along the north fence line. I came back and I took my time. I did not rush. I have learned across more years than I care to count that the moment you rush a thing is the moment you destroy it. So I worked the mattock in careful arcs around the mound's perimeter, pulling soil away in layers, not stabbing down into it. Whatever was under there had waited this long. It could wait another hour while I was careful. By the time the afternoon light had shifted and gone flat, I had cleared about 4 feet of the mound's surface and confirmed what my fingers had already told me. It was metal, dark, almost black, painted at some point long ago in a color I could not identify because so little of the original surface remained. The seam I uncovered running north to south told me it was not one piece, but two, a lid and a body, a container of some kind, large enough that I still could not see the far edges. I stopped digging. I just stood there with the mattock in my hand and looked at it. The light was going and I had no electricity at the farmhouse yet. That was still 3 weeks out, according to the man at the county co-op. I had a kerosene lamp and a sleeping bag and a camp stove, and that was the full inventory of my comforts. So I covered what I'd uncovered with a piece of canvas I used for the truck bed, weighted the edges down with stones, and walked back to the house. I did not sleep much. I lay on top of the sleeping bag in the front room and listened to the property settling around me, the creak of the roof joists, something moving in the wall that was probably a mouse, the distant sound of a dog on one of the neighboring farms. And I thought about who had put that thing in the ground and how long ago, and why they had mounded earth over it rather than simply burying it flush. A mound is a marker. A mound says, remember this place. Someone had wanted this to be found. Before first light, I was already outside. The fog was sitting low over the bottomland to the east, the kind that doesn't burn off until 10 or 11. And the grass was wet enough to soak through my boots inside of 50 steps. I pulled the canvas back and crouched down over what I'd exposed the evening before. It was metal. That much was certain. Cast iron, I thought, or something close to it. Dark gray where I'd brushed it clean, with a texture that wasn't rust exactly, but was what comes before rust. The surface that iron gets when it's been sealed away from air for a very long time. There was a seam running along what appeared to be a lid. Maybe 8 inches across, maybe 10. I pressed my thumb along the seam and felt that it was tight. Not welded, not soldered, but fitted. Someone had machined this, or had it machined. This was not a farm implement. It was not a pipe fitting or a buried tank. It was a container, made to be closed, made to stay closed. I got the short-handled spade and worked around the edges for the better part of an hour. The mound had been built up over something roughly the size of a 5-gallon bucket laid on its side. Though it was not round, it had corners, faint ones, softened by years of soil pressing in from all directions. A box, possibly 18 inches long, possibly more. When I had it mostly clear, I tried to lift it and it did not move. Either it was heavier than it looked, or it had been down there long enough that the earth had grown possessive of it. I worked the spade underneath one end and levered gently and felt it shift, just slightly, and heard a sound I cannot quite describe. Something between a sigh and a crack, like a seal breaking, or a joint finally giving after decades of holding. That was when Earl Pritchard's truck came up the road. He slowed without stopping, which is the county road version of stopping, and rolled down his window. Earl farmed the 160 acres directly to my north and had been farming it since before I was born. He was 73 years old and had the face of a man who had spent all 73 years outdoors and was not sorry about it. He looked at me. He looked at the hole. He looked at the canvas and the spade and the camp stove visible through the open door of the house. "What have you got there, Hope?" he said. "Don't know yet," I said. He nodded once, the way men nod when they have decided not to ask the follow-up question. Then he said, "Margaret Floss owned that place before the bank took it. Before her father, Otto Floss. He came over from somewhere in Bavaria, 1921 or thereabouts. Stubborn old man. Didn't trust much of anything American." He let that sit for a moment. "Didn't trust banks either," Earl said. Then he rolled up his window and drove on. I stood there in the yard for a long time after Earl's truck disappeared around the bend. The dust settled. The crickets picked up where they'd left off. And that name, Otto Floss, sat in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings out in every direction. Didn't trust banks either. I went inside and made coffee on the camp stove and sat on the floor because there was nowhere else to sit. The house had no furniture. I had no furniture. What I had was a sleeping bag, a cast iron skillet, $14 and some change after the fuel to get here, and a hole in the yard that was getting harder to ignore every time the light shifted. I thought about Otto Floss coming over from Bavaria in 1921. I thought about what 1921 looked like from the inside. The war barely cold, everything uncertain, a man crossing an ocean and ending up in Callaway County, Missouri, buying poor land on a gravel road nobody had bothered to name yet. A man stubborn enough to make something of it. stubborn enough not to trust the institutions that were supposed to hold a man's life together. And I thought about where a man like that would put the things he didn't trust to anyone else. I slept poorly. The floor was hard, and the house made sounds I hadn't cataloged yet. Every old house has its own language, and you need a few nights to learn it. By first light, I was back outside with the spade. The bump was roughly oval, maybe 4 feet across its longest axis, raised perhaps 8 inches above the surrounding grade. The soil over it was different, darker, more compact, the way ground looks when it's been disturbed and then left alone long enough to look undisturbed, but not quite long enough to fully forget. I had noticed that in the original dig. What I had not noticed until that morning with the low sun cutting hard across the yard was the second feature. About 3 feet north of the main bump, there was a line, just a seam really, a faint ridge in the earth no wider than my thumb, running roughly east to west for about 6 feet before it dissolved into the ordinary surface. You would never see it in flat light. In flat light, it was nothing. But at that angle, at that hour, it looked like the edge of something buried edge-on, just deep enough to leave only a shadow. I set the spade blade against the seam and pressed down slowly. The resistance was different here. Not rock, not root. Something that gave slightly, then held. I put the spade aside and got down on one knee and started moving the dirt with my hands. The dirt here was different from what I'd been moving all week. Darker, packed tighter, but not by time alone. By something else. Something deliberate. It came away in flat slabs rather than loose crumbles, the way soil behaves when it's been compressed against a hard surface for years. I kept my gloves off. I needed to feel what was down there before I saw it. My fingers found the edge at about 8 inches. It was flat and it was metal and it was cold in a way that went beyond the morning temperature. Not the cold of a rock. Rock holds a little warmth from the day before. This was the cold of something sealed. Something that had not breathed in a long time. I cleared a strip maybe 14 inches long before I sat back on my heels and looked at what I had. The surface was painted or had been. What remained was a dark reddish brown with the texture of old barn primer, the kind they mixed with linseed oil in the 1930s to make it last. Whoever buried this had not just dropped it in a hole. They had painted it first. That is not an accident. That is a man who expected to come back for it and wanted it intact when he did. I looked up at the farmhouse. 11 in the morning now. The shadow of the elm had moved off the east wall, and the windows were bright with reflected sky. The Hartley boy from the next property over was sitting in his truck at the edge of his field with binoculars. I'd noticed him twice that week watching. I didn't wave. I just went back to the ground. The object was a box. Not a chest, a box. Roughly 18 inches by 12, I would learn later, and about 9 inches deep. Steel construction, seam welded at the corners rather than folded, which told me someone had built this specifically. You don't seam weld a container you find at the hardware store. You seam weld something you intend to keep watertight. The lid was not hinged. It was sitting in a fitted groove, held by its own weight and 40-some years of settled earth. I did not open it there. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't caution exactly. It was something closer to respect. The same feeling you get when you find a man's handwritten notes in the margin of an old manual. Someone made this. Someone put it here. Whoever they were, they deserve at least a moment before I come along and undo 40 years of their work in 30 seconds. I lifted it with both hands and carried it to the porch. It weighed perhaps 12 pounds. Inside something shifted. Not rattled, shifted. The way papers move when they slide against each other. I set it on the boards and went inside for a dry cloth and my reading glasses. The cloth was an old flour sack, the kind my wife used to fold in thirds and hang on the oven handle. I don't know why I still have them. I have a whole drawer of things I don't know why I still have. I wiped the lid first, then the sides, then set the box square on my knees and just held it for a moment. The afternoon had gone quiet, the way it does in late September when the wind drops and the fields stop moving, and everything just waits. I took my glasses from my shirt pocket and opened the box. There were documents, not loose, bound together with a piece of twine that had gone the color of rust, though it held. Beneath the documents, wrapped in a square of oilcloth that had kept its integrity better than I had any right to expect, were photographs. And beneath the photographs, at the very bottom, sitting flat against the soldered seam, was a single folded letter and what appeared to be a hand-drawn map on graph paper, the kind with the pale green grid that engineers used in the 40s. I did not rush. I set the twine bundle on the porch rail and opened the oilcloth first. 6 photographs, black and white. 3 of them showed this property, unmistakably this property. The same barn roofline, the same angle of the hill to the east. But the barn was new in these pictures, or close to new, and there were people standing in front of it. A man and a woman, formally dressed, the way people dressed for photographs when photographs still meant something. 2 children beside them. A truck in the background I could not identify from that angle, but the running boards put it in the early 40s. The other 3 photographs were of the yard, specifically of the area around what I had been calling the bump. In one of them, the bump wasn't there yet. The yard was flat. A man I didn't recognize was standing with a shovel, and he was looking at the camera with an expression that was not quite smiling and not quite serious. The expression of a man who knows he is doing something that will matter later, but cannot say so out loud. I set the photographs down and picked up the letter. The handwriting was deliberate. Someone who had learned to write when penmanship was still taught as a form of character. The date at the top was September 14th, 1951. 73 years ago, almost to the month. To whoever finds this, it began. If you are reading this, then the time has come that I knew would come. Though I didn't know when or to whom, I read that sentence twice. Then I put the letter face down on my knee, took off my glasses and looked out at the yard for a long moment. The hole I had dug that morning was still there, a dark square against the dry grass. The light was dropping. I had maybe 40 minutes before I'd need a lamp. I put my glasses back on and kept reading. The letter was 4 pages, written front and back on paper so thin I had to tilt it to the light. His name was August Freeland. He had farmed this land since 1923, he said, when he bought it from a man who was leaving for California and didn't believe in looking back. He had a wife, Clara, and 2 sons who both went to Korea. One came back. The one who came back didn't want the land, couldn't stand the quiet after what he'd heard. August wrote that he buried the box in September of 1951 because the county had started talking about a new road, and he was afraid of what surveys and easements and men in suits might uncover if they started moving ground. He didn't trust banks. He'd watched 4 of them close in the 30s. He trusted the earth more than any institution built by men who wore neckties. What was in the box was not money. I want to say that plainly because I know what people expect. There was no fortune. There was a land deed, original from 1923, with the full legal description of 240 acres, 80 more than I thought I had bought. There was a survey map, hand-drawn, showing where the true boundary ran, along the creek bed, not along the fence line the county had recorded. And there was a letter to the county assessor, never sent, explaining the discrepancy and why August believed the fence had been moved sometime in the 1940s by a neighbor who was counting on August's silence. August hadn't been silent. He had just been waiting for the right moment. He died, I suppose, still waiting. I sat on that porch until the light was fully gone, reading by the lamp I'd brought out from the kitchen. Somewhere around 9 o'clock, I set the letter down and listened to the frogs starting up along the creek. My creek. 80 acres more of my creek if the deed held. It held. The county recorder's office in Hardin County took 3 weeks and 2 visits, but it held. A surveyor named Dale Prewitt walked the property with me in October, and when he drove his last stake into the ground along the true line, he looked at me and said, quietly, that in 30 years he'd never seen a buried deed produce a valid claim. I told him I hadn't either. We shook hands and I went home and made coffee. Roy Abner never laughed at me again. I don't think he laughed at much after that. I'm not telling you this story because of the 80 acres, or the deed, or any of it. I'm telling you because of August Freeland, who trusted the ground more than he trusted the world, and turned out to be right. I think about him most mornings when I walk the fence line. A man you never meet can still teach you something. If you've got ground you believe in, or an old machine, or a problem the experts gave up on, stay with it. The answer is usually already there. You just have to be willing to dig.